Well, good morning again, New Life. I am excited to get back into the book of Exodus. We're in week 3 of our series. We're going to be in chapter 3 this morning, so you can turn there. To kind of catch you up if you've not been with us. Last week, it was a season of wandering for both Moses and the people, right? Moses is taking action into his own hands as he kills an Egyptian, and he's forced to flee to Midian. Okay, while this is happening, the people are back in Egypt kind of wondering, hey, what's going on? Does our God hear us? Will he deliver us? And it's truly a season of wandering for everyone. Meanwhile, he's preparing both Moses and the people for a grand rescue mission. And we're going to start to see that plan unfold here in chapter 3 just in a moment. So I'd ask you this question as we get started. Have you ever wrestled with the question, what am I called to? What's my purpose? What should I be doing with my life? Man, am I in the right job, career? Should we move? Like, all of these questions, have you wrestled? Am I called to? I mentioned last week, Louis Giglio wrestled with this much of his adult life. Until his late 30s, he kind of had this thought, hey, I should start the Passion Conference and I should minister to college students. And the first year they met in a field. And it rained, right? And it didn't appear to go well, but meanwhile, he just continued to live out his calling. What I can imagine is that many of us at some point in our lives struggled with this question. What exactly is it am I called to? What am I supposed to be doing? Maybe you went to college, took on a ton of student debt to get into a career and say, is this really what I'm supposed to be doing? Maybe you moved somewhere and thought, man, is this really where I was supposed to move to? What am I supposed to be doing? So this morning, how do we figure out our calling? Years ago, there was a Christian artist, and his band was writing some songs. They were performing places, and it was almost like he realized that the songs just were not connecting. Like they would play, and no one would clap at the end. They kind of just stood there with their arms folded. And man, to imagine that, you're singing your heart out at these concerts and like no one is singing back at you. No one is responding to the songs that you're singing. And so they met as a band and said, hey, what is our future? How do we chart forward? How do we keep moving? And eventually they started playing these worship songs and realized, hey, people are connecting with these songs that we're singing. So they went to the studio to record an album and we're singing these songs, feeling like, hey, we're getting a lot of life from these songs, and realized they had one song left to record. And they thought about it and thought about it and thought about it, and just couldn't come up with the words. The rest of the band left. The lead singer was sitting with a notebook where he wrote down thoughts and ideas, and he noticed this one phrase written at the end of his notebook. 4 words, I can only imagine. Bart Millard sat there, saw these words, and it took him back to a relationship he had with his father. A relationship that for much of his childhood was marked by abuse, by alcoholism, by tragedy, and ultimately by divorce. So the parents, they split up, and then something happens in Bart's high school years. His father comes to know Jesus. And there's a radical transformation that happens. See, they go from being at odds with each other to developing a close relationship. His father passes away when he's around 18 or 19 or so. And at the funeral, Bart's grandmother said this phrase, I can only imagine. I can only imagine, man, the life that he lived coming to Jesus and now being in his presence. Bart remembered that, wrote it down in a notebook, not knowing what would happen of it, and now is sitting in a music studio years later seeing this phrase and instantly thinking, hey, that's the song. That's the song I'm going to write. It took him 10 minutes to write the song. 10 minutes to write this song. And I can imagine he did not have any idea the impact that this song would have. It was played on all sorts of Christian radio stations. I can remember one time being at home on spring break, flipping through the radio stations, listening to a secular station and out of nowhere hearing a song about heaven because people were requesting it. I can't tell you how many funerals I've either been at or officiated over the years, and one of the first questions I get is, hey, is there someone at your church that knows I Can Only Imagine? I would love for it to be sung as we remember our loved one, as we think about them being in the presence of God. It's kind of amazing that for Bart Millard and Mercy Me, they stumbled kind of backwards into their calling. Right? They weren't thinking that they would write this song and it'd be sung for years and years and years and at funerals, and that'd be so encouraging. But they stumbled backwards into it. I would suggest to you this morning, as we get into chapter 3, Moses is kind of minding his own business. He's not doing anything extraordinary when God calls him to be the deliverer of his people. See, he stumbles into an accidental calling, but in chapter 3, we're going to see it's really more of a divine appointment, that the Lord just meets him where he is. So this morning, as we get into chapter 3, here's your big idea. I want to talk to you about the God who calls. The God who calls ordinary people like me and like you to do extraordinary things for his kingdom. So let's jump into our text, starting in verse 1. It says, "Now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law, Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out in the midst of a bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, God called him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Do not come near. Take your sandals off of your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. So let's pause there. So what do we mean when we say the word calling? When we talk about the God who calls? Because I'm going to be honest with you, I think this word at times gets a little over-spiritualized. Right, so for some of you, you might be saying, hey, at 3 o'clock, I am called to sit on my couch and watch the first football game, and then the Lord's going to stir something extra, and I got to watch the second one at 6:30. You may feel on your drive this week, your commute home from work, to see a glorious red sign in the sky and say, the Lord has called me to pick up Chick-fil-A on my ride home. Friends, that's not what we're talking about with calling, right? We use this word in all sorts of different ways that I would suggest, man, the Lord never intended us for us to use. So let's make it simple this morning. Throughout the scriptures, you see God choose men and women to do extraordinary works for his kingdom. That's what we mean by calling. And that's what we mean by calling. It could be as simple as, hey, you see a need in your church and you just feel compelled to go and help. That's what we mean by calling. See, it's not an over-spiritualization. It's actually rather simple. That God calls people like you and me. God uses people like me and you to do the work that he has for us to do. See, it's not necessarily what am I called to. Here's a better question. How can I best be used by God? How can I best be used by God? See, it's really important as we look at verse 1. Notice what Moses is doing. He said he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness. See, he's shepherding. He's shepherding. He's doing everyday, ordinary work when the Lord meets him. See, the Egyptians did not look highly upon shepherds. It was a low-class kind of job. And to think, Moses leaves royalty in Egypt, identifies with his people in their suffering, and is doing a really ordinary job that a lot of society would have looked down on. He's living a simple, humble lifestyle. See, here's an encouragement for you this morning. If you are in a wilderness season, just be faithful in the small things. Be faithful in the small things. Be faithful when you don't know the big plan. Be faithful when you're not at the destination. Be faithful when you don't have it all together. Just be faithful where you are. For the person hoping for marriage, be faithful. The couple battling infertility, be faithful. The person feeling in a dead-end job, be faithful. Be faithful where you are and trust God for the outcome. Moses is doing ordinary work when the Lord meets him, and the Lord meets him in a powerful way as we get into verse 2. It says, the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of the bush. See, this is what we call a theophany. It's an appearance or manifestation of God in the Old Testament. That's what happens here. See, the angel of the Lord, Malach Yahweh in Hebrew, the angel that is Yahweh, many throughout church history, especially the early church fathers, believed that this was a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ. It's an appearance of Jesus Christ in the Old Testament. As authors would read this, angel of the Lord was really the Lord showing up and speaking to Moses, calling him where he is. See, it's his omnipresence. He's not limited to any particular time or space. But then we see a lot about God's holiness here. That Moses does not see him face to face. We're actually going to get into that later in the book of Exodus. He doesn't see him face to face. He sees the angel of the Lord and he sees the burning bush. See, fire is representative of God's holy presence. You see it throughout the book of Exodus and throughout Scripture as a whole. It's a pillar of fire that's going to lead God's people later in the book of Exodus. So you're going to see fire at Mount Sinai in the tabernacle and even at the day of Pentecost. When God forbids idolatry in Deuteronomy 4:24, here's what he says, "For the Lord your God is a consuming fire, a jealous God." See, the Lord is revealing himself to Moses, and what he's doing, he's teaching him about his character. See, if you're wondering about your calling, here's what I want to say to you. Calling is marked by an encounter with God. If you want to know what you're called to, what your purpose is, what you should be doing, what you should be pursuing, where you should be serving, any of those kinds of things, it will start with an encounter with the God of the Scriptures. And friends, this morning, you will only encounter the God of Scriptures if you are meeting with him. If your Bibles remain shut, if you remain disconnected from community, if you don't engage in worship, you will have a hard time hearing from God. It's amazing that it's that simple, that the Lord has revealed himself primarily through this book. Man, that with 10, 15 minutes a day, you could read the Bible in a year. And how easy it is in our flesh to neglect. If you want to know what you are called to, it will start with an encounter with the God of the Scriptures. See, Moses meets him, and the Lord reveals a few things about himself. See, he reveals his holiness. He tells him to take off of his sandals, for the place on which he is standing is holy ground. See, this was a common practice in ancient Near Eastern culture. To remove your shoes as a sign of respect, as a sign of reverence. A reader would have seen this and understood, but I would tell you, I really do believe we have an underdeveloped view of the holiness of God. We have an underdeveloped view of the holiness of God. It's why at times we're so careless about our sin. We're so careless about our relationship with him because we do not fully appreciate the holiness of our God. John Piper puts it this way. God's holiness is his infinite value as the absolutely unique, morally perfect, permanent person that he is, who by grace made himself accessible. His infinite value as the absolutely unique, morally perfect, permanent person that he is. To sum it all up, his holiness demands our worship. His holiness demands our worship. It demands that we reorient our lives around who he is, not try to fit him into ours. You notice that, right? Like, it's really easy to get that mixed up and say, hey, we'll somehow fit God into our lifestyle, rather than saying, hey, you're at the center of it. You get to inform every decision that's made. His holiness demands our worship. We're meant to live lives in complete surrender. And so this morning I'd ask you, is he your advisor or is he your king? See, advisors are good. Man, I've got friends I can talk to. I've got podcasts I can listen to. I have books that I read. And friends, even this fascinates me. I don't know if you guys have tried ChatGPT. It's interesting. I'll even tell you, before we had Christmas, we had people over, we were punching things in like, hey, there will be 10 people in our house. What is an easy meal that's not stressful so we could best accommodate 10 people? And the advice it gave was kind of good. Like, this is crazy, the world that we live in. See, advisors are good, but man, the books, the friends, the podcasts, even AI, here's what it can't do. It never created you. It didn't know you from the beginning. It doesn't know what's in your heart. It can't form your soul. It falls short in every way. So I ask you again, is he your advisor or is he your king? He's worthy of your worship. He's worthy of, man, reorienting your whole life around. See, that's how he introduces himself to Moses. And in verse 6, he does this again. We've talked about it for a few weeks ago. He reminds him of his faithfulness. He says, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. He reminds him of the covenant that was made. It's another reason why he demands our worship. If you want to know what you're called to, it's going to start with an encounter with the God of the Scriptures. So that's how their introduction starts. The conversation continues in verse 7. Then the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, to the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, Hivites, and the Jebusites. And now, behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppress them. Come, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. So if calling starts with an encounter with the God of the Scriptures, calling then mobilizes us for kingdom impact. It mobilizes us for kingdom impact. See, your calling, my calling, is not just for me and it's not just for you. It's meant to bless others. It's meant to lead others. It's meant to bring them to Jesus. See, calling always complements the kingdom. Calling will always complement and build and advance the kingdom. It's not me and you just doing whatever we feel like to make us happy. It's how does it accomplish God's purposes for us on this earth. See, Tony Morita, who's a pastor in North Carolina, gave 3 really good phrases to this idea, calling being for God's kingdom. There's God's motive, God's purpose, and God's plan. God's motive, God's purpose, and God's plan. And we're going to see all 3 in these verses. So there's God's motive. As we start in verse 7, he says he's seeing compassion on his people. I've heard their cry, I know their sufferings, I've seen their oppression. God's calling always reflects his heart. God's calling will always reflect his heart. There's a Presbyterian theologian who once said, the place God calls you is the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. It's where your deep gladness, your joy, and where the world's hunger, where there's needs, where it meets. Hey, we just observed Sanctity of Life Sunday, and man, thank God for crisis pregnancy centers, for people who have seen the evil of abortion and have said, hey, I'm going to stand in the gap, and I'm going to point to a better way. See, it's the world's hunger, it's our joy, it's God's glory. See, that's God's motive. I had a friend in New Jersey. He was on our team. I was a youth pastor, and he was one of our volunteers, and he taught at our local high school. And our local high school, man, they had issues. And kids would get in fights, and there were broken homes, and people were disruptive, and they were disrespectful, and there were all sorts of issues at this local high school. And I remember one time we were having coffee, and I said, TJ, I don't know how you do it. It feels like a grind. And he just said this to me. He's like, Chris, God called me to this. And I said, that's cool. Hey, God called you to be a teacher, but man, there's lots of schools in the state of New Jersey. You could literally pick any other school than the one you're teaching at right now. And he said, Chris, you didn't hear me. God called me to teach at this school. Because every now and then, man, I have a conversation with a student, and I tell them about how I'm volunteering at this church. And sometimes they come visit, and instantly, when they see me at school again, they say, hey, I think Mr. Gibbs is somebody I can talk to. And over time, I'm able to show them Christ through the way I live, the decisions I make. He said, Chris, it's a calling. And at times it's a grind. And at times it's not easy. But it's a calling. It's what God's called me to. See, that's God's motive. It reflects his heart. There's God's purpose. You see it in verse 8. It says, I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of the land to a good and broad land, out of a land flowing with milk and honey. That's God's purpose. Your calling will always align with his purpose. Whatever it is that God has you to do on this earth, it's for him. It's for his purpose. He lists that he's bringing them out of Egypt and that he's taking them to a land of milk and honey. And then he's even showing them the peoples that they would defeat in battle. If you're a believer this morning, here's the good news. This is your story, and it's my story. That God takes us out of the lives that we're in, out of the sin we're wrapped up in, that we get to meet Jesus, who stands in our place, dies a death we deserve, that we get to have eternity with him. That's God's purpose. That is God's purpose for us on this earth. But friends, let's make sure. The gospel is come as you are, but it is not stay as you are. And as we read the book of Exodus, they have to have this worked out a lot. And you're going to identify it because in your life, in my life, we have to have this worked out a lot. Right? There's struggles to overcome. There's things we fall into. But we're called to be more like his son. Romans 6, 1 and 2 puts it this way. What shall we say then? Are we to continue in sin that grace may abound? By no means. Some translations say certainly not. How can we who died to sin still live in it? It's amazing. I was reading in New Morning Mercies this morning in my quiet time, and because my kids are who they are, it's just a time, right? It's not really a quiet time. It's just a time, right? And so I'm reading in New Morning Mercies, and I love how Paul David Tripp put it. We understand the gospel as Jesus dying for our past, Jesus securing our future, and in many times we completely skip over the present. See, we can hold on to the idea of, man, thank God that our sin was paid for. We can have hope in the idea that this life is not all there is and that we're going to spend eternity with him. But friends, don't miss the middle. God wants to do something in your middle. He wants to transform your life in the middle. He wants you to change in the middle. He wants you to trust him in the middle. See, God's purpose was to take the people out of bondage, out of captivity. This morning, his purpose is to take you out of bondage, out of captivity, to take us out of the sin we so easily fall into. See, there's God's motive, there's God's purpose, and then finally there's God's plan. And in verse 10, he reveals it to him. Come, I will send you to Pharaoh, that he will bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. And I love it. It's simple. It's God just saying to Moses, hey, you're it. You're the plan. You're the plan to deliver my people. It's you. See, our God is a sending God. He's not content for us to just stay and be comfortable. He's always sending. See, New Testament believers are to be obedient to the final commandment that Jesus gave in Matthew chapter 28, the Great Commission. It says, "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. Behold, I am with you always to the end of the age." We're called to go. We're called to go, but if we're honest, man, it's a lot easier to stay. We're called to go. We're called to share the gospel. We're called to be around non-believers and bring them in, to introduce them to Jesus. But it's a lot easier to stay. See, there's an idea of maintaining versus advancing. And it's much easier to maintain something than it is to advance something. I had somebody tell me years ago, the temptation for any church and really for any believer is to drift inward. It's to focus on ourselves, to act like we have it all together, and to be completely blind to a lost and dying world around us. It's incredible. It's so easy for any of us to drift into that. There's this great quote from a poet in the 19th century. His name is John Shedd. It says, "A ship is safest in its harbor, but that's not where ships were meant to be." See, a church is safe here when we focus on just keeping everything the same, but that's not what the church is meant to be. We're meant to advance God's kingdom on this earth. We're meant to go. We're meant to be faithful. We're meant to evangelize. We're meant to share the gospel. We're meant to invite people to know the God of the Scriptures, who loves them, who created them, and has a plan for their life. In my mind, Billy Graham was like a great illustration, an example of this. In his later years, in his later ministry, it was incredible. Billy Graham would take a walker up to the stage. He would sit in the chair. He would muster the strength to get up to the podium to preach. He'd preach his heart out, immediately go grab the walker and go sit. There was another thing he used to do. Toward the end of his ministry, he would bring these bands in to do crusades. And he would say, I really don't care for the music. It's loud. I don't love the loud drums. I don't love the loud guitars. I'd prefer just as I am, right? But I don't appreciate all. He would put earplugs in during the band set. The band would stop singing. He would take the earplugs out, grab his walker, go preach. And finally, one day, somebody who was working just asked him, "Hey, if you don't like the band, why invite them? You don't have to have the earplugs. You can pick music you like." And, he just smiled. The service went on. And at the end, he gave an altar call. And as he sat down in his seat and watched hundreds of people come down to say yes to Jesus, he looked at the man that worked with him and said, "Hey, I don't care for this music, but that's why we had this band. Because they helped communicate the gospel in a way where many, many came and responded to Jesus." See, the methods, friends, the methods are constantly changing, but the message will never change. The methods will constantly be changing, but the message, it never changes. God's plan never changes. To use you, to use me, so that more would come to know him. See, God's calling mobilizes us for kingdom impact. And you would think Moses has this incredible encounter, and so he's probably just thinking, okay, let's lead the charge. Let's go get the people. But that's not exactly how it goes. Let's jump into verse 11. Moses said to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt?" He said, "But I will be with you. And this shall be the sign for you that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain." See, so you'd think, man, angel of the Lord, burning bush, the Lord instructing you directly. that you would be so fired up to just go. And yet Moses responds with this question, who am I? And scholars differ. Some believe this is genuine humility, that, hey, why would God use someone like me? Some believe this is just resistance of, hey, that seems like a really big task and I don't know if I want to go. Well, we can conclude he did not feel qualified for this position. He didn't feel qualified for the job. He didn't feel like he was the one to lead the people out of Egypt. And I'd imagine all of us have felt that way at times. Man, am I the person to parent my kids? Am I the person to do the job you have me do? Am I the person to do this? In a lot of ways, it's a moment of real doubt in verse 11. But look at how the Lord responds. He says, I'll be with you. It's a promise of presence. It's a promise of the presence of God. See, calling is always accompanied by the presence of God. It's the Lord who goes before you. It's the Lord who calls you. It's the Lord who will be with you. Calling is accompanied by the presence of God. See, I love how Philip Ricken puts it. The call to God's service always comes with a promise of God's presence. Simply put, you are not alone. Whatever it is that you are called to do, whatever it is you're feeling God's nudge to do, you are not alone. There's a well-known pastor out in the Midwest, and it's funny, he has a large church, but in his early years really struggled with public speaking, and he developed this one practice that I really appreciate. Every time he steps onto a stage to speak, he takes one giant step forward, and it's symbolic. He said, I step out of all of my insecurities, I step out of all of my struggles, I step out of all of my anxieties, and I step into the calling that God has for me. It's an acknowledgement of, hey, I don't have it all together, but I'm not alone in this. God's presence goes before me. See, no matter how successful you are, how gifted you are, what your abilities may be or not be, your calling cannot be done apart from the presence of God. Whatever it is that God has for you to do on this earth cannot be done apart from Him. So He promises His presence, and He gives him another sign in verse 12. He says, and you will serve God on this mountain. See, the fulfillment sign for Moses' call was a successful exodus, followed by the arrival at Mount Sinai, where they would worship together. It's amazing. God gives him the beginning of the plan, and He gives him the end of the plan, but there's not a lot of the middle. Right? So he doesn't know everything that's going to happen in the middle that we'll dive into over the coming weeks. And I would tell you this morning, it's just an opportunity. It's an opportunity to trust. See, this promise of meeting back on the mountain required complete dependence, complete faith. To not know exactly how you're going to get there and how it's all going to go down, or know the opposition you might face, but to trust the promise, we will worship God on this mountain. And this morning I would challenge you. I believe the Lord asks of all of us, He asks us one question: do you trust me? Do you trust me? See, Moses had to trust that they would arrive on that mountain not knowing how they would get there. And this morning he's inviting each and every single one of us to answer that question: do you trust me? Married couples, do you trust Him with your marriage? Do you trust Him with your kids? Do you trust Him with your finances? Do you trust Him with your career, with your hopes, with your dreams? For those at the end of your life, do you trust Him as you finish well? For young adults, do you trust Him as you're trying to figure out what you're supposed to be doing? High school seniors, do you trust Him as you're trying to make big decisions over what the next few years might look like? Do you trust Him? In the early 90s, there was a football player named Dennis Byrd, who played for the New York Jets. And in 1992, he was a defensive end coming around the corner, trying to sack the quarterback. Misses the quarterback, collides with a teammate, and is paralyzed instantly. he is told he will never walk again. In the hospital, alongside his Bible, he had a notebook, and he wrote down this phrase, "I will walk again." Complete faith on the God of the universe, complete faith in the doctors that were caring for him. And in 1993, about a year later, he walked out onto the field for the coin toss, an honorary captain, being able to fully walk. Over the coming years, he would travel to schools, he would travel to churches, he would give his testimony of what God did. And man, he would just be an encouragement to so many. He would share the gospel. He kept one thing from that journey. See, when the paramedics came out on the field to care for him, they had to cut through and tear off his jersey. He was paralyzed from the shoulders down. He could not move. And so he kept that torn jersey in his home that he could constantly look at, to be reminded of where he was, but to be encouraged about where God brought him. See, it's amazing what can happen when we lean in, when we trust God, when we give him our lives, when we have faith. And this morning, that was the challenge for Moses, to trust God when maybe he knew the beginning and the end, but to trust him with the middle. This morning, New Life, are you trusting him with your middle? Do you trust him, and will you give everything to him? See, we believe in a God who calls, but as we get ready to take communion in a minute, we're going to be reminded of the God who first called us to himself. See, you may struggle with your calling and what job you may work, if you should get married, how to parent your kids, what to do with your finances. But the first and primary calling for each of us is to know our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. To acknowledge that we're sinners, to believe that he died a victorious death, that he rose again, that he's preparing a place for us in eternity, and that he's here to give us abundant life here and now. And when we observe communion, that's what we're reminded of. So this morning, as we get ready to take communion, we're going to look at 1 Corinthians chapter 11. And I'm always challenged by this, and I hope for those of us who've trusted Christ that we're always challenged by it as well. There is a heart posture in which we are to take the Lord's table. In verse 27, he says, "Whoever therefore eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty, considering the body and blood of Christ. Let a person examine himself then, and so eat of the bread and drink of the cup." So this morning, we're going to bow our heads in a second. And man, I want to challenge you. You know your past week. You know your past couple of weeks. You know the ways you've fallen short. You know the things that have dishonored God. You know the lying, the gossiping that's crept in, the sexual sin you gave into, the impure thoughts, the open conflict, whatever it is. This is an invitation to bring it to the feet of Jesus. To trust 1 John 1:9, to know that he is faithful and just to forgive and cleanse us of all unrighteousness. So I'm going to invite you right now to bow your heads, to close your eyes, to just be with the Lord.